everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. I'm your host, Kylie Como. I'm the legal nurse consultant here at Shane Smith Law, and today I'm speaking with Paula Walters, a veteran paramedic, trauma survivor, and passionate advocate for change, whose journey from surviving abuse and its devastating after effects took her to being a voice that inspires others to transform pain into purpose. Paula, it's great to be with you today.
Thank you for having me back. I am honored to be here. You guys do some amazing work with this podcast, so thank you.
Thank you. We're honored as well. You're a great guest and can't wait to get into it with you. So as our longtime listeners know, and for our first-time listeners, what we do here on Mind Matters is we dig into everything traumatic brain injury. And so let's get going, Paula. Let's dive right in, okay? So Paula, from your experience, what are some of the key ways that trauma impacts survivors' physical and mental health even? Why is it important for, say, first responders or medical professionals, advocates like yourself, or even lawyers or business owners to understand this?
So trauma impacts like the entire body. And I think that people think like it's just more of an emotional thing. The thing that people don't understand is the invisible injuries that come from trauma and brain injury. So what that looks like is they have like chronic pain. They start having things like memory gaps, feeling really overwhelmed, having neurofatigue. So like for me, and one of the things that I hear lots of people deal with is like, you can't get out of bed. You are just this kind of tired that all the rest in the world can't seem to help. Well, so when I have an appointment with my attorney, or I have, an appointment with my counselor or even my medical doctor, and I just can't get out of bed, like I'll cancel at the last minute, or I might not be able to fill out my forms, and so then it starts looking like somebody's non-compliant, or they're disengaged with, therapy or treatment, or they don't really care. They might be confused. And so it can also alter those like feel-good chemicals, and especially the fight or flight, and get them to where they're really super hypervigilant, which can come across as, anxiety, mental health struggles, that they're aggressive. And so it's really easy for trauma survivors and people with brain injury to get labels. And it's very hard once you kind of get labeled to get those off of you. And people usually will often see you as that, and that's hard for survivors, because then it just kind of makes them withdraw and not be able to get more help to be able to figure and navigate those things. Yeah,
that's certainly impactful there. Can you, how might a better understanding of traumas, these physical symptoms, like the chronic pain you mentioned, the fatigue, kind of change, how might that impact the way professionals approach, or having a better understanding of that, rather have an impact on how professionals approach, diagnosing and even supporting, especially when maybe a survivor's stories or behaviors don't exactly fit those expected patterns like you mentioned?
That we need to start having more of the difficult conversations, and that's really hard for professionals to have with survivors. But like when we have somebody who is coming to us and they have chronic pain, they have chronic illness, and we can't figure out why, I advocate for, in my speaking, to tell people like, let's have the conversations about, have you ever been hit in the head? What's your ACE score? Because we know that the body does in fact keep score, and it holds trauma. And so then you start having people that have like all these autoimmune disorders. So you start getting those very like fibromyalgia. You start getting people that have like IBS, those symptoms that you can't really truly diagnose, but they can be debilitating. And yet we're not having those conversations about, and I even tell people, even as much as saying, has anybody ever put anything around your throat or made it hard to breathe? Because even that's a strangulation causes an anoxic injury.
Yeah.
So there's all these things going on physically, and then they might having palpitations, that they start getting chest pain, and it's actually not their mental state, but more of a related to the fight or flight system that they're living in. That's, and it's great to have fight or flight because it's meant to protect us. But some of us, a lot of us live there, and that takes a toll on the body.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if anybody in the audience can remember a time where they maybe have been scared, or maybe even compete in an athletic contest, and your hormones, your adrenaline is just so amped up, how you felt in those few moments afterward. So what you're saying is you have that feeling for that prolonged period of time, and that certainly can have that physical impact on the body. I can certainly attest to that. I can't imagine how prolonged periods of exposure to that sort of stimulus would impact somebody like that. That's pretty powerful. You mentioned a lot of the physiologic changes, right? Like we just discussed. So let's kind of get in more of the behavioral kind of aspects of things. What are some real world examples maybe of how trauma, might show up in survivor behavior that maybe professionals might misinterpret?
So I think that some of those things are, we look at them and they might have bad decision making. They're impulsive. They're very, as what we call wishy-washy. And then they have like bad memory recall. And a lot of times is one of those things that go with that neurofatigue is emotional dysregulation. And that can happen just from trauma. Sometimes you will cry and you don't feel like you're sad, but outward, the tears just start pouring. And that's one of the things that's very hard for people to understand is sometimes the inside emotions don't match what the outside emotions are. And then again, they can become very aggressive to the point where they get super angry, super quick, and they might be throwing things or yelling for something that seems very simple. And I think that one of the hardest things for people to understand is the memory and the mixed up memories. So sometimes people will often say, and this is where I think it gets very hard for attorneys, police officers, advocates, is that when you have a lot of trauma in the way the brain works, the brain can actually kind of blur the past and present and put trauma, pieces together and feel from something old. Well, then that looks like they're lying. So that can seem very frustrating to people. And the memory part is probably one of the hardest things, is because we know police officers or first responders have their, a critical incident. They don't get asked. Everywhere that I've traveled across the country speaking, 48 hours is the minimum before they're asked, to give their statement, because you do have that emotional dysregulation. You have the impacts of trauma. So they get 2 sleep cycles. But if we asked a trauma survivor, and this even goes for car accidents, anything where you have this incident and you're expected to give your statement right then and there. And if you change it a day or 2 later, you're embellishing, you're changing the story, you're not reliable. And that stuff sticks. And so whether it's a car accident and you've been hurt and you change your story, or a trauma survivor, domestic violence, whatever it is, now you're not reliable and you might have seemed very emotional the next couple of days. So I think that's really hard, because when we don't understand that, we really change the outcome and the impact on people's lives for a very long time.
I think most of us anyway, think of a time when we've seen, perhaps watched a sporting event on TV, right? Professional football or auto racing, and they get right to the interview right after the game. These guys and ladies have been going at it for an hour or whatever, and then they're in this heightened state, and they make some statement or comment that's just off the wall, and they may get in trouble for it. Well, kind of like what you're saying, you're grabbing them right in this moment where they're at these heightened emotions and maybe have that little bit of dysregulation. And so on a scale much smaller than what you're talking about, that absolutely makes a lot of sense. I think we just don't make those connections when you're thinking about trauma survivors. Same kind of thing, but on a much larger scale, right? Yeah. Are there any specific examples or stories that you've seen in survivors, or perhaps in your own experience, where maybe a behavior was misinterpreted by, a professional, and then what the consequences were for that individual, that survivor, or for yourself, if that's the case?
Well, so this happened to me, but here in Ohio, I do a lot of training with DV and strangulation. And one of the things that we're seeing case after case after case is there's a lot of plea bargains being done and offered because there's gaps in the story. So perhaps she can't remember how she got from the bedroom to the kitchen. Well, what do you mean you don't remember? Well, depending on what happened, we know that there's gaps in the memory, or that the ones that they've come back and said, hey, I remember this, but it's 2 or 3 days later. And so then they're like, oh, well, now you're just trying to fill the gaps because we questioned you. That was part of the reason why my abuser was given a plea deal, from a felony to a misdemeanor, was because there was gaps in my memory. I didn't remember that. Well, we have to understand that, and this is, more specific to the strangulation, is when the hippocampus doesn't get blood flow because of the pressure on the neck, no blood flow to the brain, no memory. So there shouldn't be any question of why, when there's a strangulation involved, that we wouldn't have memory of that. And so it's just those things that, somebody that should have had a felony, and because we didn't do that, went on to hurt a 16-year-old, hold her by gunpoint. So that's why it's really important, because, it's not just about that moment, but what can follow. So I think that we really need to have those conversations about those gaps in memory, or using those emotional dysregulation. I can't tell you about how many cases we've heard where police officers are showing up to DV in progress, and then she, the woman who is the one that's being beaten, is in that heightened state. So she's hitting a police officer or pushing him away, and then she's catching a charge as well. So, and if we understand that that's part of that trauma response, maybe we won't be so quick to throw those charges at her.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that kind of leads into another question, trauma-informed care. So talk to us about why that's so critical then, across all professions who might work with or more likely encounter at least a survivor or victim, as you just kind of mentioned with the police encounter.
So trauma-informed care kind of really changes us from judgment to understanding. So it's kind of like navigating that discussion of what's wrong with her or what's wrong with him to what has happened to her or what has happened to him. So especially when we have behaviors that are out of context for what's happening, and there should be this expectation that people who have just been in a near fatal situation where it's DV, or even if it's a really bad car accident, it can be any of that stuff that is just super, life-changing for people, that we need to have the understanding that there's going to be, some emotional dysregulation. Everybody does it different. You may have somebody who's very flat affect, but you might have the next person who's yelling and screaming and bawling. So we have to kind of expect that we have to also expect inconsistency, a little bit of fear, a little bit of mistrust.
Yeah.
They may add something days later, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that they're lying or that they're embellishing. That means that they've had those 2 sleep cycles that we know, how that the body needs to kind of get things up. And then we have to expect that they're probably going to have physical and emotional symptoms for days. So it's just really important to understand that those critical incidences change people and can change their lives. And we shouldn't be surprised by behaviors that we don't understand.
That's very well said. I know here at Shane Smith Law, I know we've worked very hard. We have some of our attorneys are experts more or less in those brain injury cases, the car accident especially, and we definitely have a specific approach to those. We've developed a questionnaire just to identify potential brain injury that may have been missed because, to your point, maybe some professionals on the scene don't necessarily identify those right out of the gate because sometimes it is a little nebulous at first. But once we do identify those, not only do we try to get them to the appropriate care or advocate that they get to those appropriate neuro providers or whatever the case may be, but also our approach to them changes. Our expectations are shifted a little because you said it. It just changes everything about that person, and you've got to account for that and be empathetic and understanding. So I'm very glad you brought that up. Can you describe a time in your own, professional life or otherwise, where your own trauma-informed approach made maybe a significant difference in the outcome of a survivor compared to maybe someone taking a more traditional, even maybe that inherently judgmental response approach?
And this isn't really just about brain injury, but like we go to police and EMS, sometimes we'll go to a house multiple times because we know that victims don't often leave the first couple times out. But now we've been here and she did have the courage to finally end that relationship. And now all of a sudden she's starting to have these mental health struggles. So now we're coming back to her, and we're coming back to her house because now she's drunk a lot. And now she's having all these mental health struggles. And knowing that there's a DV history there, I started asking some questions. I took a little more time. And guess what? There was a strangulation, and so now she's actually finally getting care. She's going down the neuro part. She's trying to get those MRIs and stuff like that. But she's understanding that a lot of the stuff that she's doing, and she says, I don't feel like I am myself anymore. And she says, I feel like I'm sometimes looking down at me and I can't control. I can't tell you how many of the people were like, oh, she's just a mess. She's got all these mental health struggles. Maybe it's not that, but just emotional dysregulation. So just letting her be seen and heard and giving her that space. She actually found me on my social media and sent me a message and said, thank you. So, that was very interesting because I think that there's a lot of first responders that we see the same people with the same struggles over and over and over, and we just kind of blow them off and we never think what has happened to them.
That's well said and very, very powerful. So for someone, and I think a lot of the people in the audience may be new to this trauma-informed kind of approach to things, or maybe that terminology is new to them. So for somebody new to this or new to the work, what should they look for or expect when working with survivors?
Just that whole the inconsistent, and things aren't going to be linear. They're not going to tell you this perfect story and they're not going to be the perfect witness or, patient or client. That they're probably going to have a little bit of difficulty. They might need that follow-up call or the call before to remind them of their appointment. Even maybe the morning, that extra help. And just to understand that survival behaviors that they have, because everybody's different, they're not them being difficult. They're them trying to kind of cope with the aftermath of something that was so overwhelming for them. And we all process it different. I have to remember that not everybody handles their trauma like I handle mine. There's some people that need to park there for a little bit, and there's some people that can have it and move on just fine. So really, I think that one of the key things is to not have this expectation of them and kind of be able to go with and just be understanding of their story is going to look probably very different than anybody else that you've ever dealt with, because each of them walk their trauma differently.
I think you were touching on there, and it's something I was wondering about, ways that we as professionals or even family members of somebody who's had a traumatic event to build trust, right? Is that what you're talking about, building that trust, creating that sense of safety? Because I imagine, you're terribly fearful or mistrustful in the beginning of pretty much everybody, correct?
Yeah, definitely. And here's the thing, especially if it's been something that has been lifelong for them, they've probably been wired for protection instead of connection. So them being able to be able to be connected with on any type of level is probably not going to happen. It is very, very hard for me, even at 51, even though I've been working with my functional doc since 2019. So I am 6 years into this. I still cannot connect with people as far as trusting them. It is very, very hard for me to do that. And I actively work on it daily. So they may not believe or trust anything that you say. So you have to be extra vigilant to, if you tell them that you're going to do something, to do it or be honest. And don't, just working really hard to build that trust, because they're looking for that piece of you that's going to be like everybody else before and to not trust you.
In that, as you're talking, it made me think, putting myself in the perspective of somebody who's trying to build that trust with somebody who may have been victimized or maybe suffering with a brain injury and experiencing a lot of the same symptoms and issues. I can imagine there's probably a lot of frustration or feelings of being overwhelmed as the person trying to establish that trust with that DV victim. What advice might you give to those folks?
Would probably tell them to just be honest. Say, I don't have a lot of experience with domestic violence victims. I know that it can probably be difficult to navigate that, but what ways can I help you? So for you guys in the office, is this lighting okay? Or, what time of day works better for you? Do you need a little bit of noise in the background, or do you need it quiet? Because then you're giving them options. You're giving them, choices that they probably haven't been given. You're letting them know that you're there to help them. And that might just be that one little peace offering that kind of says, oh, hey, he's actually going to listen to me, and he actually cares to make me comfortable. So it might put that guard down. But and that's a big thing, is just giving them options, and just let them know that they're being seen and heard.
I think that's great. I mean, it sounds easy enough to implement. I'd like you to kind of continue down that path. Just generally speaking, first responders, medics, police, fire, medical professionals, lawyers and other advocates, even business owners, people who employ folks who have had, been stricken with DV or dealing with brain injury. How do we incorporate that trauma-informed practice into our day-to-day work?
There needs to be the understanding of, so just to be completely transparent. So like today, I just traveled the last 2 days. If I had to work this morning, I would probably call off. I mean, I am absolutely exhausted. And maybe that's one of those conversations where I could tell my boss, like, I just need a couple more hours of sleep. So I'm not missing my whole 12-hour, but just kind of having that understanding of being more transparent, of asking them, asking people of, hey, are you really sick, or are you just extremely tired? And kind of just building those relationships where, if I know that my person might be having an anxiety attack, I can ask, is there anything I can do to help you, kind of navigate that, or just, giving people spaces, or having things where, I know for me, I have a lot of stuff that I bring in my bag to work that helps keep me grounded, to help me work on my brain, to work on my mental health. But I don't let people see that, because I don't want people to question it. But I have a space that I can go in and close the door. Well, there's certain offices you're not going to have that. So maybe giving them the space. And I think it's just about having conversations, giving people safe spaces. It really bothers me, because this happens to me, and I hear it from all kinds of survivors, where, well, do you expect to be treated different because you have a brain injury? You look fine. Like, I don't understand. Why are you saying you feel like this today? Because you look perfectly normal to me. Yeah, because it's an invisible injury. What you see here isn't what I feel absolutely horrible on the inside. But we're used to wearing, that happy face, and sometimes we can't. So I think it's just giving those spaces of honesty, being able to talk to them, and let them know that, like, I'm going to try to help you. Now, are we going to have people that are going to take advantage of that? Yes. But again, it's just kind of, helping them, because maybe then they won't be missing so much work. They won't be, using the FMLA so much. They won't be, being mean to other customers. It really does help everybody all the way around.
Truly, that's fantastic, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, your expertise, Paula, and obviously your passion here. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for another amazing episode of Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injuries and Concussions. Again, I want to thank and give our gratitude to Paula Walters for joining us today and sharing her expertise, her insight, and her passion with us. Please look for her website, The Courageous Survivor, for more about her story and links to her other powerful content. I hope that our audience has enjoyed this insightful and thought-provoking discussion as much as I have, and is walking away with a deeper understanding and appreciation of recovering, living, and thriving with a brain injury. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with all of our latest and greatest content, and leave us a comment let us know what you thought of today's discussion. And as always, remember, if you're in pain, call Shane at 980-999-9999. We'll see you later.
In pain, so I call Shane. 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.